Imagine you are standing on the edge of the world, not at a cliff, not at a shoreline, but at the very boundary of everything you know. Above you, a sky full of fire, thousands upon thousands of burning points of light, scattered across a darkness so complete and so absolute that it presses against your eyes like a physical thing. There is no city glow on the horizon, no distant sound of traffic, no hum of electricity. Only the wind, the creak of some unseen animal shifting in the dark, and the vast, indifferent silence of the ancient world. Now imagine what you would think. Not what you would feel in terms of hunger or cold or fear, though those would certainly be present. But what would you think? Would you wonder what those lights were? Would you ask yourself why you existed in this moment, on this particular patch of earth, under this particular sky? Would you look at the stars and feel small? Would you feel awe? The answer, extraordinarily, appears to be yes. And we know this not because anyone was there to record the thoughts of the first human minds, but because those minds left something behind. They left art. They left tools made with unnecessary care. They left the dead buried with flowers. They left their handprints pressed into cave walls as if to say, I was here. I existed. I mattered. The story of how the human mind came to be capable of such things is perhaps the most extraordinary story ever told. It stretches back further than most of us dare to imagine, through hundreds of thousands of years of slow transformation, through ice ages and migrations and near extinctions. It is a story not just of brains getting bigger, but of something harder to measure and harder to define. The gradual kindling of an inner life. The birth of what we call consciousness. But what even is consciousness? Where does it begin and where does it end? And when, exactly, did the lights come on inside the human mind? To understand where consciousness came from, we first have to grapple with what it actually is, and that is harder than it sounds. In fact, it might be one of the hardest questions in all of philosophy and science combined. Consciousness is the thing you are using right now to read these words. It is your awareness of yourself as a being that exists in time and space. It is the fact that there is something it feels like to be you right now in this moment. The warmth of the room, the slight weight of your own body, the inner voice that narrates your thoughts. Philosophers call this the hard problem of consciousness. Not hard in the sense of difficult, though it certainly is that, but hard in the sense that it resists being solved by the same methods we use to explain everything else in science. We can explain how the eye detects light. We can trace the path of a visual signal from the retina through the optic nerve and into the brain's visual cortex. We can map every neuron involved in the process, but none of that explanation tells us why any of it feels like anything at all. Why is there a subjective experience of seeing the color red rather than just a mechanical process happening in the dark? This gap between objective description and subjective experience is the abyss at the heart of consciousness studies, and it haunts every scientist and philosopher who looks into it. What we do know is this: consciousness, whatever it is, appears to be produced by the brain. When specific areas of the brain are damaged, specific aspects of conscious experience change or disappear entirely. Patients with damage to a region called the hippocampus lose the ability to form new memories, meaning each day dawns fresh and bewildering. Patients with certain forms of damage to the frontal lobe can lose the ability to plan, to feel appropriate emotions, to understand social consequences. The self, it turns out, is not a fixed and eternal thing. It is a construction, an ongoing project assembled by billions of neurons firing in precisely choreographed patterns. But if consciousness is a product of the brain, then it must have come from somewhere. Brains did not always exist. They evolved, and that means consciousness evolved too. Which raises a question that is both exciting and deeply unsettling. When? Let us go back, a very long way back. Around 540 million years ago, in the warm, shallow seas of the early Cambrian period, something remarkable happened. Life, which for billions of years had existed mostly as simple, single-celled organisms, suddenly erupted into extraordinary complexity. Within a geologically brief span of time, the ocean filled with creatures of bewildering variety. Animals with shells, with legs, with eyes, with mouths designed to seize and consume other living things. This explosion of complexity is known as the Cambrian explosion, and it may have been the moment when the first flickers of something like awareness appeared on Earth. The reason scientists think this is not sentimental, it is functional. When animals began hunting other animals, they entered an evolutionary arms race of perception and reaction. A creature that could detect a predator sooner than its companions, one that could process sensory information faster and respond more flexibly, would survive more often. And surviving more often meant leaving more offspring. The pressure to develop nervous systems capable of rapid, flexible, experience-based decision-making was immense. From this pressure, the precursors of the brain emerged, simple clusters of nerve cells called ganglia, which could receive information from the environment and coordinate a response. Over time, in some lineages, these ganglia consolidated and grew more complex, until eventually you had something worth calling a brain. But does having a brain mean being conscious? This is where things get philosophically thorny. Most researchers today draw a distinction between what might be called primary consciousness and higher-order consciousness. Primary consciousness is the simpler form. It is the awareness of immediate sensations, the capacity to feel pain or pleasure, to learn from experience, to have preferences about the immediate world. A fish swimming away from a shadow because shadows have previously preceded attacks is engaging in a rudimentary form of this. It is not just reacting. It is, in some minimal sense, experiencing. Higher-order consciousness is something quite different. It involves the ability to think about one's own thoughts, to imagine scenarios that have never occurred, to plan for a future that does not yet exist, to assign meaning to symbols and representations. It requires what neuroscientists sometimes call recursive thinking, the ability to loop back on your own mental states and examine them. This is what allows humans to write poetry, to experience existential dread, to fall in love with an idea. The question of exactly when primary consciousness shaded into higher-order consciousness in the human lineage is one that researchers are still working to answer. But the archaeological record offers some extraordinary clues. Before we follow those clues into the deep past of our own species, there is one more thing worth saying about the nature of consciousness itself. Something that tends to get overlooked in the grand evolutionary narrative. Because it happens every single night. You lose consciousness, and then you get it back. Sleep is one of the strangest features of animal life, and one of the most revealing. Every night, the brain does not simply switch off. It cycles through a complex sequence of states, some of them involving intense, vivid, emotionally charged activity. We call this dreaming. And dreaming is, in a very literal sense, conscious experience without a body, without external sensory input, without the anchor of the physical world. When you dream, you are somewhere. You are someone. You feel fear or joy or that particular dreamlike mixture of familiarity and wrongness that defies description. You have a perspective. And that perspective, research suggests, is not the same as your waking perspective in every respect. The prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with rational planning and reality testing, is relatively quiet during REM sleep, the phase in which most dreaming occurs. The limbic system, which processes emotion and memory, is highly active. Dreams are, among other things, a form of emotional processing in which the brain runs simulations of social and emotional scenarios, testing responses, consolidating experiences, integrating new information with old. The fact that all mammals and most birds appear to experience REM sleep, and that the brain activity associated with it in other species closely resembles the activity observed during human dreaming, suggests that this form of processing is ancient. It predates our species. It predates our genus. The capacity to construct an internal experience independent of the external world may be one of the most evolutionarily conserved features of the vertebrate brain. If that is right, it means that the raw material of consciousness, the brain's capacity to generate an inner world, has been present in the lineage that gave rise to us for a very long time indeed. What changed over the course of human evolution was not the presence of inner experience, but its content, its depth, its relationship to language and symbol and self. The dream became something that could be told. The inner world became something that could be shared. And once inner worlds could be shared, everything changed. We need to talk about a skull. It was found in 1921 at a site called Broken Hill in what is now Zambia by a mine worker named Tom Zweiglar. It lay buried deep in the rock, staring up at the pale African sky with hollow eye sockets. The bones of its enormous face fused and mineralized over hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists today estimate it to be somewhere between 299,000 and 324,000 years old. This skull belongs to a species called Homo heidelbergensis, a hominin that roamed Africa and Europe during a vast sweep of prehistory that most of us know almost nothing about. Homo heidelbergensis is one of those species that sits in the murky middle of human evolution, between the earlier and more primitive Homo erectus and the later anatomically modern Homo sapiens. In many ways, the Broken Hill skull looks startling. The brow ridges are enormous, jutting forward above the eye sockets like a thick stone shelf. The face is massive. To modern eyes, the skull looks somewhere between human and something powerfully, unmistakably ancient. And yet, when scientists study the brain case, they find something that gives them pause. The cranial capacity is around 1,280 cubic centimeters. That is within the normal range for a modern human brain. This is one of the central puzzles of human evolution. Our brains reached roughly their current size considerably earlier than we became behaviorally modern. Something was happening not just in the growth of the brain, but in its organization, its wiring, the emergence of new connections between regions that allowed for new kinds of thought. To understand that process, we need to look not just at skulls, but at what the people who owned those skulls were doing with their days. Around 300,000 years ago, at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, a group of early Homo sapiens lived, hunted, and died in what is now a limestone cave. They were our species' earliest known representatives, and when researchers excavated the site and analyzed what they found there, they discovered that these ancient people were making a specific kind of stone tool with unusual care. The tools are known as Levallois points. What makes them remarkable is not just their sharpness or their utility, although both are considerable. What makes them remarkable is the level of planning required to produce them. A Levallois point is not just a rock that has been bashed into shape. It is the result of a precise multi-step process in which the toolmaker first shapes a stone core into a specific form and then, with a carefully aimed strike, detaches a flake of exactly the right shape from that core. The finished point can then be hafted onto a wooden shaft and used as a projectile weapon. This process requires the toolmaker to hold in mind an image of the finished tool before they begin. They must work backward from a desired outcome, planning each step of a sequence that will take many strikes to complete. They must be able to anticipate the consequences of each action and adjust their technique accordingly. In short, they must have something very much like foresight. Foresight is one of the hallmarks of higher-order consciousness. It is the ability to mentally simulate futures that do not yet exist and to make decisions in the present based on those imagined futures. And here, embedded in the flint and chert of a Moroccan hillside, we can see evidence of it operating in a mind that lived and breathed and died 300,000 years ago. But stone tools, however sophisticated, are a blunt instrument for measuring consciousness. They tell us about planning and skill. They do not tell us about inner experience, about identity, about the meaning these ancient people attached to their world. For that, we need different kinds of evidence, somewhere around 164,000 years ago, on the cliffs of what is now South Africa's southern coast. A small group of people scraped red pigment from iron-rich rock and ground it into powder. We do not know exactly what they did with that powder. They may have mixed it with fat and painted their skin. They may have used it to mark their tools or their belongings. They may have used it in ceremonies we can only dream of reconstructing. What we know is that they processed it deliberately, with clear purpose and intent. This is the ochre of Pinnacle Point, discovered by the paleoanthropologist Curtis Marion during excavations that began in the closing years of the 20th century. And it is, for many researchers, one of the most moving pieces of evidence in the entire record of human prehistory. Not because of what it tells us about technology. Ochre is not a tool in the usual sense. It does not cut or scrape or pound. Its value is symbolic. It communicates something. It marks and transforms. And to use a substance for symbolic purposes, you need a mind capable of symbolic thought. Symbolic thought is the ability to let one thing stand for another. To allow a red smear on skin to represent vitality or protection or belonging to a particular group. to let a carved line on a shell represent ownership, to let a circle of stones represent a boundary between the sacred and the mundane. These are not obvious or automatic ways of thinking. They require a mental capacity that, as far as we know, exists nowhere else in the animal kingdom to the degree it exists in us. Or does it? That question will become important later. For now, consider the staggering implication of the pinnacle point ochre. At a moment when the human species was, according to genetic evidence, teetering dangerously close to extinction. When climate change had dried the African interior into something close to desert and pushed our ancestors into small, isolated refuges along the coastline. Even then, even under those conditions of existential pressure, people were not just surviving. They were performing rituals. They were decorating themselves and their world. They were thinking symbolically. Consciousness, it seems, did not wait for easy times to emerge. About 300 kilometers east of Pinnacle Point, perched above the churning waters of the Indian Ocean, there is another cave. It is called Blombos, and what archaeologists have found inside it over the past 3 decades has rewritten our understanding of when modern human cognition truly began. The most famous object from Blombos is a small piece of ochre, roughly the size of a thumb, discovered in 2002 by a team led by Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen. On its flat surface, someone had engraved a precise geometric pattern, a series of crossed hatched lines forming a diamond-like grid. The engraving is deliberate, careful, and clearly intentional. And it is approximately 75,000 years old. This is not in itself unique. Incised lines on ochre appear at several African sites from this period. What is remarkable about the Blombos ochre is the precision and regularity of the pattern. It is not a scratch. It is a design, not an accidental mark. It is a design conceived and executed with evident purpose. Whether that purpose was decorative, whether the pattern carried some symbolic meaning, or whether it served as a kind of ownership mark, we cannot know. But the fact that a human being 75,000 years ago sat down and deliberately engraved a geometric abstraction onto a piece of mineral tells us something profound about the mind behind the hand. Abstract patterns do not exist in nature. A grid of crossed lines refers to nothing in the physical world. To create one, you must first conceive of it as a possibility, then plan the sequence of strokes required to produce it, then execute that sequence with enough precision that the finished result matches the conception. This is the signature of a mind that can operate in the realm of the purely abstract. But Blombos gave researchers even more to think about. Alongside the engraved ochre, Henshelwood's team found something else: shell beads. 41 small shells, all from the same species, all with holes punched through them in the same position, all with traces of ochre suggesting they had been painted or handled by paint-stained hands, and all strung together to form what appears to have been a necklace or some other form of personal adornment. These beads are significant for several reasons. First, they are old. Approximately 75,000 to 80,000 years old, making them among the earliest known examples of personal ornament anywhere in the world. Second, the shells were transported to the cave from the coast, several kilometers away, suggesting the beads were valued objects that people carried with them, rather than opportunistic creations made from whatever was at hand. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the beads were almost certainly meant to be seen. Personal ornaments are social signals. They communicate something about the wearer to others: membership in a group, status, identity, affiliation. You do not wear a necklace in the dark. You wear it so that other people can see it and understand what it means. That act, wearing a symbol intended to communicate identity to others, requires a sophisticated theory of mind. You must understand that other people see you and form impressions of you. You must understand that a physical object can carry social meaning beyond its material nature, and you must be embedded in a community that shares the code, that knows what the beads mean. The Blombos beads are therefore not merely personal decoration. They are evidence of a social world built on shared symbols, and that is the foundation on which all human culture rests. Now let us move forward in time, roughly 100,000 years, and move from the southern tip of Africa into its interior and then out across the world. Between 80,000 and 60,000 years ago, the human population of Africa appears to have expanded rapidly after the long bottleneck. Genetic evidence points to a sharp increase in population density and social connectivity during this period. Groups that had previously lived in relative isolation began to encounter each other more frequently. Trade networks, however rudimentary, began to form. Ideas and innovations could now spread from one group to another in ways that had been impossible when humans were scattered thinly across a continent. This matters enormously for consciousness, because consciousness, at least the higher order kind that involves complex symbolic culture, is not just a product of individual brains. It is a product of connected minds. A single genius born into total isolation, without language, without teachers, without the accumulated knowledge of generations before them, could not develop the full range of human cognitive capacity. We are not self-sufficient minds. We are social ones. And the expansion of social networks around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago may have been one of the key triggers that allowed human consciousness to develop the extraordinary complexity we see in the archaeological record shortly afterward. This is what some researchers call the social brain hypothesis. The idea is that much of what makes human cognition distinctive was not selected for because it helped individual humans solve physical problems, but because it helped them navigate the complex landscape of social life, keeping track of who was allied with whom, anticipating the intentions and emotions of others, understanding reputation, managing cooperation and conflict within groups. These demands placed enormous selective pressure on the parts of the brain involved in social reasoning, language, and theory of mind. Theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have their own mental states, their own beliefs, desires, and intentions that may differ from your own, is one of the most cognitively demanding abilities any animal possesses. And humans have it to a degree that appears unmatched in the rest of the natural world. We can not only model other people's thoughts, we can model their thoughts about our thoughts. We can think about what someone believes we believe. We can understand lies, irony, fiction, and persuasion, all because we can hold in mind a representation of another mind's representation of reality. This ability, sometimes called recursive theory of mind, may be the cognitive foundation, on which all human culture is built. Around 70,000 years ago, something else happened that may have been equally important. Humans left Africa. Not for the first time. Homo erectus had done it roughly 2 million years ago and spread across much of the Old World. There is evidence of Homo sapiens making brief forays out of Africa before 70,000 years ago. But the expansion that began around this time was different in scale and consequence. It was the migration that ultimately led to humans inhabiting every continent on Earth except Antarctica. This migration brought our ancestors into contact with environments they had never previously encountered. Dense temperate forests, vast grasslands, frozen tundras, and critically, it brought them into contact with other human species. In Europe, they encountered the Neanderthals, a species that had been living on the continent for hundreds of thousands of years and had developed a sophisticated culture of their own. In Asia, they may have met the Denisovans, known primarily from genetic traces and a handful of fossils, and in both cases, the encounters did not end in the clean replacement of one species by another. They ended in something far more intimate. They ended in interbreeding. The genetic evidence for this is now unambiguous. Modern humans outside of Africa carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Some Asian and Pacific Islander populations carry traces of Denisovan ancestry as well. We are not purely Homo sapiens. We are a mosaic, the product not just of our own evolutionary history, but of encounters and entanglements with minds that were, in some ways, very like ours. This raises a profound question that researchers are only beginning to wrestle with. If we interbred with the Neanderthals, and if some of what they contributed survives in us today, was what we have in common greater than what divided us? Were their minds, in the ways that matter most, essentially like ours? The site of La Pasiega in northern Spain had been visited by archaeologists for decades before anyone paid close attention to a particular section of its cave wall. The wall is deep inside the cave system, in a chamber that requires navigating twisting passages and ducking under low overhangs to reach. On the wall, someone had painted a series of red lines, a rough ladder-like shape, and a scattering of geometric marks. For years, researchers assumed these paintings were the work of Homo sapiens, who were known to have used the caves of northern Spain extensively. But in 2018, a team led by geochemist Dirk Hoffman applied a dating technique called uranium-thorium dating to the thin mineral crust that had formed over the paintings. The result was unexpected, and to many researchers, frankly, astonishing. The paintings dated to at least 65,000 years ago. That is roughly 20,000 years before anatomically modern Homo sapiens are believed to have arrived in continental Europe by the conventional timeline. The only hominins present in Spain 65,000 years ago were Neanderthals. This finding, published alongside similar dates from 3 other Spanish cave sites, sent shockwaves through the paleoanthropological community. If it held up, and subsequent research has generally supported rather than undermined it, it meant that Neanderthals were making abstract art, planning and executing complex visual compositions, choosing pigments, preparing surfaces, working deep inside caves where there was no natural light, before Homo sapiens had set foot on European soil. What followed was a heated and sometimes bitter scientific debate. Some researchers argued the dating could not be trusted. Others suggested the paintings might represent only the most basic kind of mark-making, too simple to qualify as true symbolic art. Still others clung to the acculturation hypothesis, the idea that Neanderthals, upon encountering Homo sapiens arriving from Africa or the Middle East, might have learned to make art by watching or copying their more cognitively advanced neighbors. But the acculturation hypothesis requires Homo sapiens to have been present, and at 65,000 years ago, they were not. What remains, if we accept the evidence, is a conclusion that many researchers are now increasingly willing to reach. Neanderthals were symbolic beings. They were capable of abstract thought and intentional creative expression. And their consciousness, whatever precise shape it took inside those differently structured skulls, was not the blank and brutish thing that older generations of scientists imagined. Consider for a moment what we know about Neanderthal life. They survived some of the harshest conditions the Pleistocene epoch could throw at them. Ice ages that drove most life south. Volcanic eruptions of extraordinary scale. The constant pressure of hunting large and dangerous animals with handheld spears. They did this not as solitary creatures, but as members of small, tight-knit social groups. They cared for their elderly and infirm, as we know from skeletons showing healed injuries that would have been fatal without sustained assistance from others. They buried their dead, at least sometimes, with deliberate care. Their tools, known as the Mousterian industry, were sophisticated and varied. They hafted stone points onto wooden handles using adhesives made from birch bark tar, a process that requires heating birch bark to specific temperatures and collecting the resulting pitch. To make birch bark tar effectively, you must either heat the bark in a low-oxygen environment or produce a fire of precisely controlled intensity. Either method requires planning, experimentation, and the transmission of technical knowledge from one individual to another. They hunted not just with ambush tactics, but by driving herds of horses and other large prey toward cliffs or narrow valley bottoms where they could be more easily killed. Coordinating a hunt of this kind requires not just communication, but the capacity to share a mental model of a plan, to understand your own role within a larger strategy, and to adjust your behavior based on what others around you are doing. In short, Neanderthals were not automatons. They were thinking, planning, socially aware beings whose cognitive lives were, in the ways that mattered for day-to-day survival, remarkably close to our own. And yet they are gone. Our species is here. Theirs is not. What does that tell us about the nature of human consciousness and the specific qualities that allowed Homo sapiens to outlast every other hominin species on Earth? Part of the answer may lie in language, not just the ability to make sounds that carry meaning. Other species can do that in limited ways. But the specific kind of language that Homo sapiens developed, a system capable of generating an infinite range of novel sentences from a finite set of grammatical rules, and capable of referring not just to things present in the immediate environment, but to things distant in space and time. Things that happened yesterday, things that might happen tomorrow, things that never happened at all. This kind of language, what linguists sometimes call displacement and recursion, is extraordinarily powerful. It allows humans to share not just information, but mental models of the world, to coordinate behavior across time, to transmit knowledge across generations without the knowledge bearer being physically present, to tell stories. Stories deserve more attention than they usually get in discussions of human evolution, because they may be one of the most important cognitive technologies our species ever developed. A story is a compressed, transmissible simulation of a social situation. When you hear a story about someone who trusted the wrong person and was betrayed, your brain runs a mental simulation of that scenario and updates its model of how trust works. You learn from an experience you never had. Stories allow humans to learn from the experiences of others across time and space, multiplying the effective pool of knowledge available to any individual far beyond what they could accumulate in a single lifetime. Stories also allow humans to transmit the invisible, the beliefs and values and norms that hold a society together. You cannot point at justice. You cannot touch honor or shame or sacred obligation. But you can tell a story that makes those concepts vivid and real and emotionally compelling. And once a group shares a set of stories, they share a world. They can cooperate on scales and in ways that no other species can approach. Language was almost certainly not the only medium through which early humans built and maintained their shared inner worlds. Music may have been equally important and equally ancient. Every known human culture has music. It appears to be as universal as language, and in some ways even more so. A melody can move people to tears across cultural divides that language cannot bridge. The emotional power of music appears to be deeply wired into the human nervous system. It activates the same reward circuits as food and sex. It synchronizes the brain states of people listening together in ways that pure speech does not. Some researchers have proposed that music preceded language in human evolution, serving as a form of social bonding and emotional communication before the full complexity of grammatical speech emerged. The primatologist Robin Dunbar, who developed the social brain hypothesis, has written extensively about the role of music and communal singing as a form of vocal grooming, a way of binding groups of people together through shared rhythmic and melodic experience. Singing together, moving together, breathing together. These activities generate feelings of solidarity and trust that are difficult to produce any other way. There is archaeological evidence suggesting that music is very old indeed. A flute carved from vulture bone was discovered at the Geisenklosterle cave in Germany, dated to around 43,000 years ago. At Hohlefels, another German cave, a flute made from the ivory of a mammoth was found alongside figurines, including the famous Venus of Hohlfels, one of the oldest known pieces of figurative sculpture in the world. These instruments were not primitive prototypes. They were fully functional musical tools, capable of producing a range of notes. The people who made and played them were musicians in any meaningful sense of the word. But the existence of these instruments does not mean music was invented 43,000 years ago, any more than the existence of the oldest known cave paintings means painting was invented at that moment. Instruments made from wood, skin, and gut do not survive. Rhythmic striking of resonant objects leaves no trace. Human voices, the original and perhaps the most powerful musical instruments, are made of flesh and leave nothing behind. Music almost certainly predates any physical evidence for it by an enormous margin. What we can say is that music, like language, like art, like ritual, is a technology of consciousness. It is a way of shaping inner experience and sharing that experience with others. It is one of the mechanisms by which human minds reach beyond the boundaries of individual skulls and touch one another across the gap. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar has proposed that language itself evolved primarily as a form of social grooming. In other primates, physical grooming, picking through each other's fur, serves to build and maintain social bonds. But physical grooming is time-consuming and can only be done with one individual at a time. Language allows a single individual to bond with multiple others simultaneously, gossiping, sharing news, telling stories, performing the social rituals that hold groups together at scales that physical grooming could never sustain. Dunbar's famous number, around 150, represents the approximate maximum size of a cohesive social group that a human brain, without additional social technologies like writing or institutions, can maintain. Beyond that number, the web of relationships becomes too complex to track without external scaffolding. But even 150 is vastly larger than the social groups of any other primate. And it may be language that makes it possible. But if language was so critical to the development of human consciousness, when did it emerge? And could other species, Neanderthals perhaps, have had it? The anatomy of speech is one line of evidence. Producing the full range of human speech sounds requires a larynx positioned lower in the throat than it is in other primates, creating a resonating space above the vocal cords that allows for the complex acoustics of language. Fossilized larynges do not survive. But the base of the skull, the basicranium, curves in a way that correlates with larynx position, and Neanderthal basicrania appear to be similar to those of modern humans, suggesting they may have had the anatomical capacity for speech. More direct evidence comes from the FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene, though that is a significant oversimplification. FOXP2 is involved in the fine motor control of the vocal tract and is associated in modern humans with certain aspects of language learning and speech. In 2007, researchers analyzing DNA from Neanderthal remains found that their version of FOXP2 was identical to the modern human version, not similar but identical, at the specific sites that differ between humans and other primates. This does not prove that Neanderthals had language in the full human sense. FOXP2 is one of many genes involved in language, and the relationship between genetics and cognition is enormously complex. But it suggests that whatever vocal communication Neanderthals engaged in, the neural machinery underlying it may have been more like ours than unlike it. What seems increasingly clear is that Neanderthals were not silent. They communicated. They coordinated. Whether they had the full recursive grammatical capacity of modern human language, whether they told stories, whether they had myths and rituals in the richest sense, we cannot know. But the old image of them grunting and gesturing around a fire belongs to a version of prehistory that the evidence has thoroughly dismantled. And then there is the matter of what happened to them. Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record. The last known Neanderthal remains come from sites in southern Spain and Gibraltar, at the southwestern tip of Europe, as if the species had been slowly pushed into a final corner from which there was no retreat. And then they were gone. For decades, the prevailing explanation was violent replacement. Homo sapiens arrived in Europe and simply outcompeted the Neanderthals, or actively killed them. The image was of a biological conquest, a slow-motion extinction driven by superior Homo sapiens intelligence. But this story has been complicated by the genetic evidence of interbreeding. You do not leave 4% of your DNA in the genomes of the species that destroyed you. The relationship between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was evidently more complex, more entangled, than a simple story of replacement suggests. What most researchers now think is that the Neanderthal extinction was the result of a combination of factors: population size, reproductive rates, the ability to adapt cultural strategies rapidly to changing environments, and possibly the transmission of diseases to which Homo sapiens had some immunity and Neanderthals did not. In other words, not a war, but a slow, grinding demographic asymmetry in which Homo sapiens populations grew where Neanderthal populations did not. Some of that asymmetry may indeed have had cognitive roots. The density and reach of Homo sapiens' social networks, the speed and fidelity with which they could transmit and accumulate cultural innovations, the symbolic systems that allowed them to coordinate behavior across larger groups and longer distances. These may have given our ancestors an edge that, compounded over thousands of generations, proved decisive. But the Neanderthals were not swept away because they were not conscious. They were swept away despite the fact that they were. Let us come back to the caves, because caves are where so much of the most vivid evidence for ancient human consciousness has been preserved, and there is a reason for that. Stone is durable. Paint applied to the interior of a limestone cave in an environment of stable temperature and humidity can survive for tens of thousands of years. The paintings at Altamira in Spain, discovered in 1879, were so perfectly preserved that the archaeologist who first described them was initially accused of fraud. They looked too fresh, too vivid, too alive to be 30,000 years old. And when you look at what these ancient artists depicted, it is hard not to feel a shock of recognition. The horses at Lascaux in France, painted around 17,000 years ago, are rendered with a naturalism that speaks to long observation and genuine love for the animals. Their muscles move under painted skin. Their manes blow in an invisible wind. The person who painted them knew horses, not just as prey animals, but as presences, as subjects worthy of attention and care. At Chauvet in southern France, dated to perhaps 36,000 years ago, and among the earliest known examples of figurative painting by Homo sapiens, there are lions drawn in charcoal with a confident, sweeping line that suggests an artist who knew exactly what they were doing. There are rhinoceroses arranged in dynamic compositions that suggest not just observation but imagination, the ability to create a scene, to stage a drama on a rock face deep inside the earth. Why deep inside? This is a question that has preoccupied researchers for generations. Many of the most significant Paleolithic paintings are not near cave entrances, where they would have been made in natural light and easily seen by passers-by. They are in the deepest, most inaccessible chambers, reachable only by crawling through narrow passages in total darkness, navigating hazardous terrain by the uncertain light of animal fat lamps. This suggests that the act of making the art, and perhaps of viewing it, was not casual. It was deliberate. It may have been ritualistic. Perhaps these chambers were places where certain people, perhaps specialists with particular knowledge, went to perform ceremonies that required separation from the everyday world. Places where the boundary between the living and the dead, or between the human and the animal, was felt to be thinner. That word, ritual, points towards something that may be among the most important and least understood aspects of human consciousness. Religion, or more precisely, the capacity for what anthropologists call supernatural thinking. Supernatural thinking is the ability to believe in agents, forces, and entities that cannot be directly perceived: gods, spirits, the souls of the dead. The animating powers believed to inhabit animals, rivers, mountains, and storms. This kind of thinking appears to be universal in human cultures. Every human society that has been studied, past or present, has some form of belief in forces or beings beyond the immediately visible world. Why would this be? What evolutionary pressure could have produced a tendency to believe in things that cannot be seen? One influential explanation is that supernatural thinking is a byproduct of hyperactive agency detection. Humans are extraordinarily good at detecting agents, beings with intentions and desires that can act on the world. This is adaptive. If you hear a rustling in the undergrowth, it is better to assume it might be a predator and be wrong than to assume it is just the wind and be wrong. The cost of false positives is minimal. The cost of false negatives can be your life. But this agency detection system, because it is calibrated to be sensitive rather than precise, tends to find agents everywhere. We see faces in clouds. We hear voices in white noise. We intuitively feel that a universe as complex and ordered as ours must have been made by someone, because in our experience, complex and ordered things are always made by agents. From this tendency, it may be only a short step to believing in gods, in spirits, in the souls of ancestors who continue to influence the world after death. And once those beliefs exist, they have enormous social consequences. Shared beliefs about supernatural agents create communities of shared obligation. If we both believe that the same spirit is watching over us and will punish wrongdoing, we have a powerful incentive to cooperate and to trust one another that goes beyond anything that could be maintained by direct social monitoring alone. Some theorists argue that it was this cognitive capacity for supernatural thinking, combined with the language to articulate and transmit beliefs, that allowed Homo sapiens to scale up social cooperation to sizes and complexities that other species, including Neanderthals, could not match. The ability to share myths, to build identity around shared stories about gods and spirits and sacred places, to create obligations that extended beyond the face-to-face group. This, on this view, is what gave our species its decisive edge. But there is a deeper question lurking behind all of this, a question that goes beyond the archaeology and the genetics and the evolutionary models. Why does consciousness feel the way it does? Not what it does, not what it is made of, not when it evolved, but why there is something it is like to be conscious at all. Why is the processing of information by the brain not simply dark and mechanical, as the processing in a computer appears to be. Why does it generate this inner theater, this sense of being a self that watches and feels and wonders? Some philosophers argue that consciousness is an intrinsic feature of matter, something that exists wherever information is integrated in the right way, present perhaps in all living things, and perhaps even in simpler systems, just in vanishingly small amounts. This view is known as panpsychism, and while it has traditionally been dismissed as mystical, it has in recent years attracted serious philosophical attention because no one has been able to disprove it, and because the alternative explanations have their own serious difficulties. Other philosophers and scientists argue that consciousness is an emergent property, something that arises from the complexity of neural processing in ways that are not yet understood, but that are in principle explicable in purely physical terms. On this view, the experience of being conscious is real, but it is entirely a product of the brain's activity, and there is nothing mysterious about it, except that we do not yet have the scientific tools to explain exactly how it emerges. Still, others take more radical positions. Some argue that consciousness is itself a kind of illusion, that what we call subjective experience is a story the brain tells itself about its own processes, a helpful fiction rather than a genuine metaphysical fact. Others argue that consciousness is the one thing we can be certain is not an illusion, since the experience of doubting consciousness is itself a conscious experience. What is perhaps most interesting is how ancient these debates are. Long before there was cognitive science or neurology or evolutionary theory, humans were grappling with exactly these questions. The ancient Greeks distinguished between the psyche, often translated as soul, but meaning something closer to the animating principle of life, and the nous, a higher faculty of reason and intellect. The traditions of Buddhist philosophy developed elaborate analyses of the nature of consciousness, distinguishing dozens of different types and subtypes of mental states, and examining the relationship between self, experience, and awareness with a sophistication that continues to inform modern cognitive science. This universal, cross-cultural preoccupation with the nature of mind is itself perhaps the most revealing evidence of what human consciousness is. We are the species that wonders about itself, that looks in the mirror not just to groom, but to question, to ask, who is looking? There is a moment, sometime in the development of a child, around the age of 18 months to 2 years, when something remarkable happens. You hold up a mirror, and they recognize themselves. Before that age, a child looking in a mirror sees another child, an interesting child, perhaps a friend to be played with or a rival to be concerned about, but not themselves. And then, usually somewhere in the second year of life, recognition dawns. The child touches their own face while looking at its reflection. They understand that the face in the mirror is the face they wear. They have developed, for the first time, a coherent model of themselves as a being that exists in space, that has a body, that can be seen from the outside. This is called self-recognition, and it is one of the simplest and most powerful tests for a particular kind of self-awareness. And it turns out that very few species pass it. Chimpanzees do, orangutans do, elephants do, dolphins do. And in studies conducted under particular conditions, so do European magpies, a finding that surprised almost everyone when it was first reported. What these species have in common is not a specific brain structure. Magpies have no neocortex at all, the region of the brain long thought to be the seat of higher cognition in mammals. What they seem to have in common is a certain kind of social complexity. They are all species in which survival and reproductive success depend heavily on accurately modeling the mental states of others, on understanding competition and cooperation, on tracking relationships over time. This suggests that self-awareness, the capacity to model oneself as an object in the world, may emerge not from any single neural structure, but from a general cognitive demand. The need to understand one's own position in a complex social landscape. For early humans, living in the expanding, increasingly connected social networks of the African Middle Stone Age, the demands on self-modeling would have been intense. Who am I in relation to these others? What do they think of me? How can I influence their behavior? How am I perceived? These questions, arising from the demands of social life, may have driven the development of a self-model of extraordinary sophistication, one that eventually became capable not just of representing the self's current position, but of imagining the self in the past, the self in the future, the self as others see it, the self as it might have been if different choices had been made. And once you have a self that rich, that reflective, that temporally extended, you are very close to something we would recognize as fully human consciousness. Let us return one final time to a cave. This one is not in France or Spain or South Africa. It is in Borneo, on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And the painting on its wall is of a pig. A warty pig, to be specific, native to the island and clearly important to the people who lived there, painted in dark red ochre with a confident, naturalistic hand. The pig stands in profile, its features are detailed, its posture suggests movement, life, presence. Around it, there are smudged handprints, the outlines of human hands pressed to the stone and blown over with pigment. The same gesture appears on cave walls across the world, from France to Patagonia to Australia. Of all the images early humans chose to make, the handprint may be the most universal. And its meaning, whatever specific cultural significance it carried in each place and time, feels somehow immediately comprehensible across the gulf of tens of thousands of years. I was here. Look, a hand like yours. The Sulawesi pig has been dated to at least 45,500 years ago, making it one of the oldest known pieces of figurative art in the world. But recent reanalysis has suggested the date may be closer to 50,000 years. And because uranium-thorium dating provides minimum ages, the true age of the painting may be older still. What strikes researchers about this painting is not just its age, but its sophistication. It is not a crude or halting first attempt. It shows the work of someone who had been trained, who had a tradition to draw on, who worked within a cultural context of image-making that had presumably been developing for some time before this particular artist put this particular pig on this particular wall. Which means the tradition of figurative art in Southeast Asia is older than this painting. How much older, we do not know. The global pattern that emerges from sites like Sulawesi, from Lascaux and Chauvet in France, from the cave art of South Africa, from the geometric engravings of the Blombos Cave, is not one of a sudden flowering of creativity in a single time and place. It is a pattern of multiple origins, of independent developments, of consciousness expressing itself in symbolic form wherever it existed and wherever conditions allowed. This should not surprise us. If consciousness is a product of brains of a certain type and organization, and if the brains of modern Homo sapiens were already in place by 300,000 years ago, then consciousness was already there, waiting in those skulls for the social and environmental conditions that would allow its fullest expression. It did not erupt from nowhere 40,000 years ago in an Ice Age cave in southern France. It had been building slowly across continents and millennia in the minds of people who left fewer traces simply because they lived in different conditions, used different materials, or because what they made has not survived. We are left then with a picture of human consciousness that is far older, far more complex, and far more widely shared than the simple story of a Homo sapiens revolution would suggest. Consciousness, in its most basic forms, reaches back into the deep past of animal evolution, perhaps all the way to the Cambrian seas. The capacity for awareness, for learning from pain, for making choices based on subjective experience, appears to be woven into the fabric of complex nervous systems far more broadly than we once imagined. The specifically human form of consciousness, the capacity for higher-order thought, for planning and abstract reasoning, for symbolic expression and cultural transmission, began to emerge in our lineage well over 1 million years ago, in the stone tools and shaped objects of Homo erectus. It developed through the long middle of human prehistory, in the sophisticated toolkit and social behaviors of Homo heidelbergensis and the people of the African Middle Stone Age. It was present, in some form, in the minds of Neanderthals, who painted caves and decorated themselves with shells and ochre long before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. And it reached its present form, or rather its present starting point, because human consciousness continues to evolve, not just biologically but culturally, through the explosive growth of social networks and symbolic communication that began sometime in the African Middle Stone Age and has been accelerating ever since. We are the product of all of this. Every person alive today carries in them the accumulated weight of hundreds of thousands of years of developing minds. The discoveries and inventions and stories and rituals of numberless generations of conscious beings, each one of them wondering in their own way what they were and why they were here. We are the inheritors of every ochre-stained hand, every carefully buried body, every note played on a bone flute in the dark. That inheritance is not just genetic. It is cultural, emotional, and spiritual, passed down not through DNA alone, but through the fragile, stubborn continuity of human meaning-making across the generations. And perhaps that is the truest definition of human consciousness. Not the capacity to think or to feel or even to plan, but the capacity to ask, to sit under a sky full of stars and feel, with a peculiar mixture of wonder and vertigo, the enormity of what we do not know. To reach back through time toward people we will never meet, and to feel, somehow, that we recognize them. That is not just a cognitive achievement, it is a moral one. It is the foundation of empathy, of history, of science itself. We are the species that looks at the universe and asks what it is. We are the species that looks at itself and asks who is looking, and refuses to be satisfied with silence. That is extraordinary. That may be the most extraordinary thing about us, and it began, as far as we can tell, not with a revolution, but with a hand pressed to a cave wall, and a breath blown through cupped palms, and a small human figure stepping back to see what it had made, and recognizing it, perhaps for the first time in the history of life on Earth, as something created, as something that had not existed before, as something made not from necessity, but from the pure, mysterious, irreducible desire to leave a mark, to say, I was here, I thought about things, I looked at the world, and I tried to make sense of it. We are still doing exactly that. We always will be. There is one more aspect of human consciousness that deserves to be named before we reach the end of this story. One that is rarely discussed in the context of evolution, perhaps because it is too personal, too close, too loaded with significance for the people doing the discussing. We are the species that knows it will die. This awareness, the certain knowledge that the self, this inner world we have spent a lifetime building, will one day cease to exist, is not obviously adaptive. You might expect evolution to select against it, since the terror of annihilation, if dwelt on too deeply, could paralyze. And yet it is universal in human experience, and apparently absent from the experience of every other species on the planet. A dog mourns the loss of a companion in ways that are clearly emotional. But there is no evidence that the dog lies awake at night, contemplating the eventual extinction of its own consciousness. Why do we have this knowledge? The most likely answer is that it is a byproduct of exactly the same cognitive capacities that make us so successful in other respects. The ability to project oneself into the future, to simulate scenarios that have not yet occurred, to think about one's own mental states from the outside. All of these, applied to the overwhelming evidence of mortality all around us, produce the inescapable conclusion that we too will die. And this knowledge, rather than simply being a burden, may have been one of the most powerful drivers of human culture. The urgency to create meaning, to leave something behind, to be remembered, to believe in some form of continuity beyond physical death. These motivations have produced religion, philosophy, art, and some of the greatest monuments ever built. The pyramids of Egypt, the cathedrals of medieval Europe, the Homeric epics, the Upanishads, these are all, among other things, responses to mortality. Attempts to make something that will outlast the individual life. The earliest evidence we have of deliberate burial, of the careful placement of a body in the ground with objects that suggest a belief in some continuation after death, comes from sites like Kafze in Israel, where Homo sapiens buried their dead around 90,000 years ago alongside ochre and shells and the antlers of deer. Whether these objects represented grave goods for an afterlife, or symbolic markers of identity, or simply expressions of grief, we cannot say. But they tell us that by 90,000 years ago, humans were already grappling with death in ways that went far beyond the immediate physical fact. Grief is itself a form of consciousness. To grieve is to be aware that something irreplaceable has been lost, that the person who was here is no longer here, and that this absence is not temporary. It requires a model of the other as an individual with unique inner life, and an understanding of the permanence of death. Other animals show behaviors that resemble grief. Elephants return to the bones of dead companions and handle them gently. Chimpanzees sometimes carry the bodies of dead infants for days. But the human experience of grief extended across time, shaped by cultural ritual, transformed into art and story and memorial, suggests a depth of consciousness that these behaviors, moving as they are, do not fully match. We grieve because we love. We love because we are aware of other minds as real and precious, and we are aware of other minds because we have inner lives of our own, rich enough to recognize the inner lives of others and to know what their loss means. In this sense, consciousness is not just the ability to think, it is the ability to care. We are left, then, with a picture of human consciousness that is far older, far more complex, and far more widely shared than the simple story of a Homo sapiens revolution would suggest. The story of how our minds came to be is inseparable from the story of our ancestors, the real people whose thoughts and choices and creativity made us who we are. And if you want to discover your own connection to that long human story, My Heritage can help. My Heritage makes it easy to build your family tree and trace your origins through billions of historical records, including birth and marriage records, military documents, newspapers, and censuses. Their tools can colorize old photographs, bringing the faces of your distant relatives vividly to life. Using their Discoveries feature, I found nearly 1,800 family connections I hadn't known about, and was able to trace one line of my ancestry back to the 18th century. These are the real people, the conscious minds, who gave rise to you. Thank you for watching the entire history of the human mind. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy our previous videos. Subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and we'll see you next time.